Hi, this is Jennifer Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I'm delighted to welcome Adam Hochschild, a renowned historian. And I want to talk to him today about his book, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Jen. It's good to be with you.
You write about a period in time that bears some resemblance to the current era. There were a lot of deportations. There was the beginning of a really surveillance state and violation of civil liberties. There was a anti-radicalism furor. There was anti-labor sentiment. Explain how that came about and why we fell into that very dark period of time, which your book illustrates.
Well, the period of 1917 to 21, which is what I wrote about in American Midnight, was really, I think, the most repressive period in American life since the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And here's what happened. Uh, First, in April 1917, the United States entered the First World War. And going to war, and it was at that point the largest war the world had ever seen, does something to a country. It sets off a burst of the worst kind of rabid, unthinking patriotism, and people immediately rush to find German spies everywhere. In fact, there were very few German spies because their network had been infiltrated and wrapped up a couple of years previously. Then, in the fall of 1917, uh, came the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks, the most extreme faction in Russia, took over. And this accelerated the paranoia in the United States because a lot of people in power in the US, in the government, in the business world, were frightened that the Russian Revolution might spread to the United States. Not a realistic fear, I don't think, but it increased the level of paranoia here. And I think it's important when we look at this period to realize that it's not exactly the way it's usually portrayed in high school history books, which always tell us that the United States was a peaceful country. Then in 1914, the nations of the old world and Europe started tearing each other apart. And finally, those nasty German submarines started sinking American ships, and we had to enter the war. Well, the US was not a peaceful country. Uh, First of all, there was a great deal of violence between business and labor. It was routine for dozens of people to be killed each year as businesses put down strikes. There were more than 70 people killed in a single strike in Colorado, 1913-14 alone, many of them women and children, as company police and state militia suppressed a miners' strike. So that was one form of violence. Then there was a lot of nativism in the air. And that part, I think, a little bit resembles what's going on in the United States right now. Uh, our nativism today is mainly directed at people trying to slip across the southern border, especially those from Latin America, Africa, other parts of the world. A century ago, the nativist rage was against immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, which meant primarily Italians, Poles, and Jews. And there was a lot of that in the air. And of course, that got increased by the paranoia of this period. And finally, there was our longstanding racial tension in the United States between a white controlled South that didn't want to admit that it had lost the Civil War, and Black people trying to get ahead, in many cases fleeing the South into northern cities where there too they found immense racial discrimination. So all of these tensions were inflamed when the two events of 1917 happened, the US entering the war and the paranoia about the Russian Revolution.
It's the through line between then and now that at a time of upheaval abroad, rapid change domestically, that people resort to certain patterns, certain tropes in American history, nativism, a disregard for civil liberties. Is that somewhat of a connection between that time and the present era?
I certainly think it is. I mean, it was eerie as I immersed myself in that 1917 to 21 period for several years when writing this book to feel how much aspects of it resemble today. For example, in the presidential elections of 1920, there were leading candidates for both Republican and Democratic nominations who were promising mass deportations. Uh, and thundering about aliens invading our shores. The whole question of birthright citizenship was raised by many people there, saying, why should we have it? If somebody's causing trouble as a labor agitator, deport him back to wherever his parents came from, even if he was born here. So that is very much one of the continuities I see.
At the time, there was a president who was considered a progressive, Woodrow Wilson. And of course, during part of this time, the war was going on. And then during part of this period of time, he was very much involved in the Paris talks and the eventually what came to be the Versailles peace treaty. What did he think of all this? And why, as a progressive, at least in our current lingo, did he not put a stop to this, or was he in favor of this?
Woodrow Wilson is a fascinating and paradoxical figure, really worthy of a Shakespeare tragedy, because he was a progressive in many ways. He favored the graduated income tax, end to child labor, uh, greater regulation of business, and so forth. And he was very much an idealist when it came to something that was really partly his invention, the League of Nations, the idea that the nations of the world should gather around a table and talk out their differences instead of going to war. Who could be opposed to that? He was passionate about it. Was this a practical dream? I don't think so. I don't think the League of Nations, even if the US had joined, would have been any more effective at stopping war than the United Nations has been since 1945. But nonetheless, it was an idealistic dream, and Wilson almost died for it because, in very frail health, he embarked on a month-long, grueling nationwide speaking tour, trying to get people to pressure their senators to get the U.S. to join the League of Nations. And it was on that trip that he exhausted himself and had the first of two near fatal strokes that basically knocked him out of commission for the rest of his presidency. But at the same time, he presided over enormous repression. During the 4 years of his second term, there was press censorship on a huge scale in the United States. The government essentially shut down 75 newspapers and magazines whose politics it didn't like. It prevented from being mailed, which was the only way you could nationally distribute something at that point, several hundred additional issues of others. There were roughly 1,000 Americans who spent a year or more in prison, and a much larger number spent shorter periods of time solely for things that they wrote or said. I don't mean that nobody did anything violent during that period, because there were some anarchists who threw bombs and so forth. But these were people who, by any definition of the term, were political prisoners. And finally, there were vigilante groups all over the country, roughing people up, staging citizens' arrests, and so on. And the largest of them, something called the American Protective League, with about 250,000 members, was sponsored by the US Department of Justice. So all this Wilson presided over, didn't seem to pay much attention to it. He left the running of this whole repressive apparatus to others while he thought about the League of Nations. Very strange and paradoxical man.
Fascinating. And of course, many of the things you just listed, attacks on the free press, are eerily familiar to many of us now. It's interesting that after reading the book, on one hand, I was a little bit depressed. On the other hand, I was gratified because eventually this period of time ended. And if not a entire restoration of free and liberal democracy, this heightened period of repression and antagonism towards civil liberties did end. How did it end? And are there any lessons there for us today as we now suffer, frankly, in another regressive period of time?
It basically ended when Wilson left the White House in March of 1921. Warren Harding, not one of our great presidents, took over. But Harding, crooked as he may have been, and certainly some of his associates were, had been a newspaper publisher before he went into politics, didn't believe in censorship of any kind, and gave orders that it be stopped. He also, uh, rather too slowly, but he did it, let almost all the political prisoners out of jail. And the most prominent one of them, Eugene V. Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party in the United States, who had been sentenced to a 10-year term for speaking out against the U.S. entering the First World War, Harding invited him to the White House on his way home. And Debs, who had run for president many times, said, I've run for the White House 5 times, but this is the first time I've ever actually gotten here. Another thing that I think brought this period to an end was that when people are paranoid and are predicting a disaster and it doesn't come, it can take the wind out of their sails. And in this case, the principal disaster predictor was Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, who had his eye on the Democratic nomination for president in 1920. And he repeatedly predicted that May 1st, May Day, the International Workers' Holiday, 1920, would see a communist uprising throughout the United States. And, police forces called in extra shifts. J.P. Morgan hired extra security guards. They posted federal troops various places, and absolutely nothing happened. And that sort of took the wind out of the Red Scare. So I don't think there are directly lessons for us today. And I think a disturbing difference between that time and today is this. We may well find that, and I think it'll be reflected in the congressional elections, the midterm elections in 2026, that Trump and his people can no longer appeal to the population about the dangers of gender changing ideology infiltrating our schools and so on. That appeal will wear off. The other kinds of paranoia they appeal to about people pouring over the southern border will wear off because there are very few people coming over the southern border and haven't been for many months. But by the time we get to have people's disillusionment reflected in those midterm elections 2 years from now, they will have taken apart a large part of the federal government. They already have their whole government agencies, which in effect have been shut down. Some of them may get, put back together again in some partial way. I think the other thing that's different from before, and that really gives us the worst constitutional crisis that we've faced since the Civil War, is that Trump and Vance have made clear that they're going to ignore court decisions that they don't like. Trump said the other day, and Vance echoed it, if you do something to save your country, it's not illegal. Well, whose definition is it? What's saving the country? This is unprecedented because almost any president you can appoint to going back to the Civil War, when faced with a court decision, sometimes they grumbled about it, but they didn't try to defy it.
It is a lesson that elections matter and presidents matter. I want to end on what I think is a hopeful note, and that is that even during this period of time, there were individuals within the bureaucracy, within the federal government, who strove to do the right thing. And I think of, obviously, in the wake of the resignations in the Justice Department in the Southern District of New York, there was such a gentleman who really did prevent many more deportations. Tell us a little bit about him and maybe what lessons we might have from his behavior during this period of time.
This is sort of one of my favorite characters from this period, a man named Lewis F. Post, who was the number three person in the Labor Department. And then by a fluke in 1919, he became acting Secretary of Labor because the Secretary of Labor was on sick leave. The number two person had resigned to run for the Senate. Post became acting Secretary of Labor. Meanwhile, the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, was warming up to run for president on a platform of mass deportations. And he staged the notorious Palmer raids in late 1919, early 1920, where he arrested 10,000 people all over the country. People who, because they were not yet US citizens and they were involved in left wing politics in one way or another, he thought could be deported. But there was one wrinkle. Even though the Justice Department, Palmer's Justice Department, had the power to make those arrests and did so, deportations had to be approved by the Immigration Bureau, which fell under the Labor Department. And Lewis Post, the man I was talking about, was a very decent person who believed that nobody should be deported from the United States because of his or her political opinions. He was able to stop most of the deportations to the absolute fury of Palmer and Palmer's deputy, the very young J. Edgar Hoover, who had really engineered the Palmer raids. And Hoover was furious, tried to get Post fired, tried to get the American Legion to investigate him, did get Congress to investigate him, but Post acquitted himself very well and stayed in office until the last day of the Wilson administration and stopped most of those deportations. But that, I fear, is something that at the moment it's going to be much harder for a decent person high in the US government. And there are many career civil servants who are decent people high in the US government. It's going to be much harder for them to act in these ways because President Trump and his people have made clear that they're going to fire people going quite far down into the bureaucracy. And I fear the courageous people are going to be folks like the acting U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, who just resigned. But if the good people resign, that leaves us with an even worse collection of people running the government. So I wish I could end on a note of great optimism, taking a lesson from history, but I'm finding that rather hard at the moment.
Well, I think the lesson really is elections matter. People can't afford to go to sleep at the wheel of democracy, and that little acts of courage do matter and do change outcomes. So thank you, Adam, for being with us and for your strangely timely book, which I'm sure you didn't think was so timely when you began it, but we'll have you back to comment more in the future.
Okay. Thank you, Jen.